Hello everyone. So I'm going to do something a bit different again today. I wanted to do an analysis of game design for all the cards in Rise of the Bloodborn. So I'm going to go through each of the cards one by one. There's only 39 of them, so that should be doable. I'm going to talk about not only what each one does and how it fits into the meta, but also my opinions on how it was designed, what it says about the game, or what it says about Counterplay's intentions for the game, and sort of evaluating it, as it were, from that perspective, not just how good it is or what decks it fits into, but how it's designed, how it's put together, what it says about the game, what it means, as it were, for the game at large, and what I like about it from the perspective of the process of creating cards like this. So, as a disclaimer, I'm not a professional game designer. I'm an amateur. I do make games. I've spent probably over half my life making games, designing games as a hobby. Learning about games, playing games, thinking about games. So hopefully I've picked up enough stuff along the way for this video to be relevant and interesting. If not, I guess you can always turn it off. But fingers crossed I can put out something pretty useful and pretty interesting. So I've literally just put on the Rise of the Bloodborn card filter in the collection manager. I'm just going to start from one end, go all the way through. Was there anything else I need to cover before I started? Yes, feel free to ask questions in chat, or if you're watching this on YouTube after the fact, feel free to get in touch, comment, etc. I'm more than happy to listen to other people's opinions or elaborate on my own, and I'll pay attention to chat as much as I can while I'm streaming this. This is sort of, rather than recording this as a video, because this is going to be probably quite long, I don't know how long exactly, it depends how much I have to say about each individual card. I'm live streaming it and then I'll just go and play normally afterwards. Which means that I can answer people's questions as we go if anyone shows up. So yeah, basically, plan is, I'm going to talk. Feel free to interrupt me with questions or whatever. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to get in touch with me after the fact if you want to know more stuff, or want to disagree with something I said. I'm just going to kind of give my thoughts as they come up. So let's start from the start. So the first thing we have is Draining Wave. So this card is quite interesting. One of the most compelling things you can do in game design is ask questions of your players. So if I make a card, right, if I make Storm Metal Golem, I make a big 8/8 with no abilities, it doesn't ask very much of the player in order to use it, right? You cast it, it goes on the battlefield, and then it moves around and hits things in the face. Now, this is a very good card for when you're starting to play the game, because Duelyst's core mechanics are quite complicated, so having a card that has no text but just moves around and hits stuff, and rewards you for doing that by hitting things very hard, because it's a big flashy golem, is a valuable thing. For more experienced players, it's worth having cards that have a bit more to them, and I think Draining Wave falls into that category. When you look at Draining Wave, the question it asks you is, why is this good? Right? I mean, a lot of questions asked by cards boil down to why is this good, but with Draining Wave that's particularly acute, I think, because the card is obviously very strong if you ignore the downside, and obviously very bad if you look only at the downside. You're not going to spend a card to deal 4 damage to yourself and nothing else. And generally cards with downsides are very good for doing this, very good for asking questions of your players. They say, is this worth it? Is the upside worth the downside? And how, if not, how can you make it so? So I think in a meta as aggressive as we currently have, which I imagine the developers predicted, we know they want Duelyst to be fairly fast and dynamic. We know it was reasonably grindy during Shimzar, and it's a lot faster now, and I have to assume that's on purpose. So in an aggressive meta, or even in a tempo-ish meta, because this is a tempo card, because it's so cheap removal, even in an aggressive meta, dealing 4 damage to yourself is really bad, right? So that's quite a big downside. Now there are some decks where you ask that question, why is Draining Wave good? And the answer is because I don't care about my own life total. If you're playing a deck that's more aggressive than your opponent's, you can take as much damage as you want, in theory. We'll get to that in the Magma section, most likely. You can take as much damage as you want, let's say, provided you clear your opponent's board and hit them in the face and win the game that way. So you see this in Hearthstone. You have Warlock decks. Fast Warlock decks like Zoo take a lot of damage from their own hero power. So in Hearthstone you have hero powers instead of Bloodborn spells. Pretty similar mechanic. The Warlock's hero power lets you spend 2 mana to deal 2 damage to yourself and draw an extra card. It's really powerful, but obviously you take consistent damage while doing so. Warlocks also have cards that are more powerful than usual, but deal damage to their controller when you play them. Like they have a 3/2 for 1, but it damages you. Draining Wave is exactly that sort of card in that deck. It's a card that cares about you being faster than your opponent, whereupon you get to play a card that says 1 mana, deal 4 damage. Because if you don't care about your life total in this matchup, then that's not relevant. Another way you can answer that question is, of course, by healing yourself. And this is another quiet push to heal Lyonar. Because one of the big difficulties with heal decks is actually having things to heal. You have to untap with minions on the board. You have to try and stick things and heal them through multiple turns to get value out of the Bloodborn spell by itself. It's all a lot more difficult than just using Raw and making a large minion this turn. You can just play something and roar it. Job done. So with healing, you generally play things that combo with it. You play Sunforged Lancer, for instance. But you obviously need to have things to heal for that. But your general doesn't go away until the game ends. So taking damage to your own face allows you to then play, Healing Mystic next turn, heal yourself back up, and that turns on maybe your Lucid Beam. So you remove a couple of minions very efficiently and make a nice early game tempo swing. So that's another answer to the question, why is this card good? It's a very well designed card, I think. It's not that powerful, just because the downside is quite big. But it's a really nice tempo swing in a faction that's quite tempo-y, is all about winning the board and sticking the board, having the one big minion that your opponent can't deal with. And to do that, you have to win the game early on. So cards like this are fantastic for that. They also, 1 mana spells fit really well into a faction with a clunky curve. Because in Lyonar, you're so often playing 1 card a turn if you're playing a mid-range deck. Like you're playing an Ironcliff Guardian, or you're playing a Silver God Knight, and that's it. You often end up with spare mana, and Draining Wave slots right in to have a very powerful effect on the game for that 1 mana, at the cost of, obviously, its downside. But if you've got the board, and if you've got a big provoke, you can maybe take 4. Maybe that's okay. So there's another answer to why is this card good. Maybe you just need it. Maybe it just does a lot for your deck. So it's quite cool. There's a lot of ways to use it, considering how, it's a very little text. It just deals 4 damage to your face and is a cheap removal spell. But that's quite a powerful design because it's got a lot more depth to it than you might otherwise assume. So I really like this card. Prism Barrier. Do you know what? When this was spoiled, I thought, oh god, I really don't want to play against that. And I haven't seen a single one cast. I haven't played Gauntlet yet in this new format. I've actually been saving up. I've got 150 gold that I'm sitting on, but I haven't actually gotten around to using it because I haven't had the time. So I imagine this card is pretty terrifying in Gauntlet. In Constructed, maybe not so much. So I like this as a design as well. I think it's not very often that it's going to take up a card slot in your deck. There's so many things competing for that space that Prism Barrier it's that card that kind of falls by the wayside. It doesn't necessarily help you deal extra damage this turn. It doesn't do anything by itself. You have to have a minion to put it on. It's vulnerable to Dispel. It's vulnerable to hard removal, etc., etc. But we all know from playing against Sunsteel Defender that Force Field's a great mechanic. It's very, very powerful. Being able to take damage every turn and attack for free every turn is insane. In a game where every time you do anything, including hit the opponent in the face, you take damage. In Hearthstone, you can hit your opponent in the face for free. In Duelyst, you can't. So Force Field breaks that dynamic. And obviously, that kind of warps how the cards are designed. So Prison Barrier allows you to put that, air quotes, game-breaking mechanic on anything you want, and that's pretty compelling. I think the amount of tempo you can get out of this card is considerable, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see it played at some point, maybe alongside Aegis Barrier, or something like that, maybe in an Arcanist deck, because it's a very, very strong effect, and putting Force Field on a large provoke is going to very quickly end the game by just making your opponent unable to do anything if they don't have some kind of answer to it. We've seen that Grove Lion's really good, and Prison Barrier is like that, but for your minions, and I think that's quite an interesting thing to put in the game. I thought Grove Lion was quite a cool design as well. It just kind of really changes the game around it. Being able to put Force Field on cards that aren't supposed to have Force Field, I think that's pretty interesting as well. But it's a bit of a shame that the card isn't so powerful that you'll actually play it, at least in Constructed. Maybe you would in Gauntlet, but I think if it was, it would be too annoying. Like if it drew a card or something so everyone was running it, it would just be so frustrating to have to work through Force Fields time and again. So it's actually the sort of card that you don't want to be too powerful in case it ends up taking over the game. You don't actually want that much Force Field in Duelyst, because like I said earlier, the game's not designed to have minions be able to survive attacking every turn and take extra free damage every turn. There is that attritional element to the game where minions do slowly take damage for everything they do. It's the same way attacking obelisks against Vitruvian feels so cheap, because they can't hit you back. You just get free damage, and that's so hard to find in Duelyst. So having this card, although it costs you a card, gives you this sort of, air quotes, infinitely efficient minion that your opponent struggles to deal with. So it would be, if the card was actually really pushed, I think it would be very frustrating. It's quite interesting to see a card that is better at the power level it's at, even if that power level isn't very high, just because someone somewhere will find a use for it and it'll be insanely annoying, or someone will identify, people aren't running very much Dispel right now and everyone's running a lot of damage based removal. I'm going to put Prison Barrier in my deck and just laugh at people. It's like a sleeper card, which I think is important to have in card games. Like, one thing I see people say a lot is, why can't Counterplay go back and buff old unused cards? But there's a few arguments against that. To rattle through them quickly, it's pretty risky. You might break the game. There's always going to be a cream of the crop. Like you can close the gap, and I think Duelyst as a game does a very good job of closing the gap between most of the bad cards and most of the good cards. There's a few outliers, but generally the cards are roughly the same power level. And the other thing is that it's actually fairly healthy for card games to have crap cards. Like, it doesn't really do them much harm. It means there are cards that don't see play every day, but that's fine. You have finite slots in your deck. You can't play everything. As long as the game presents you with enough viable options that there's interesting stuff to do. We have formats like Gauntlet that force you to make do with the crap cards. And if you want to experience everything in the game, you play Gauntlet, where the bad cards are good now because just having stats is valuable. And that's where a card like Prison Barrier can shine. It's it will be occasionally useful in Constructed when the meta's right for it. It will be occasionally terrifying in Gauntlet when your opponent doesn't have an answer to it. Sometimes you'll have to put it in your deck because the other two cards are even worse. And then you're like, actually, this does a thing. Now I'm playing this Prison Barrier and getting some value off of it just because it's in my deck and I might as well make use of it. It's the sort of card that can produce learning experiences, even if it's not, dominating the meta right now. Not every card wants to do that. Next up, Scintilla. I love this card. I think it has one of the best animations they've ever done. That's amazing. This card I really like. I think it's very... I looked at this card and I was like, yes, that's perfect. That's exactly what slower Lyonar decks want. It's a mid-sized minion. It's a good turn 3 drop. Goes alongside your Silver God Knight or your Sojourner. It has utility in the early game because it's a 3/4 for 3. It has utility in the late game because it gains you life. So it's a bit more it's more top deckable, like in a deck that has mostly good cards and not much draw, like a typical mid-range deck usually is. Having cards that are good early and good late is very strong. So it's important for Lyonar in particular to have these cards that are just generically good anywhere. And it's important for Lyonar to have healing, not just because of Zeran, but because they're meant to be one of the more defensive factions. I mean, right now everyone's playing Tempo Lyonar or Aggro Lyonar, and there are cards like Draining Wave which suit that as well. You know, Lyonar are very good at pushing face, and they have a lot of good tempo plays to make because it turns out great cards are great, even the cheap ones. But I was really happy to see a card that directly supported slower or even just mid-speed Lyonar decks to allow them to outlast aggro decks a little bit. I like how it gets value even if it's not removed, but against a control deck, it gets value even if it's immediately removed because you can gain 3 health off it straight away. But against a control deck, it's not a must-remove threat. It's, you know, when the game is all cards that get value immediately regardless of whether they're removed and then also have to be removed, so they're impactful, games get very tedious. I think Magic the Gathering has had a bit of this problem in Standard over the past few years. We've had a lot of very good threats that are hard to remove or get value in the face of removal or both, and that also demand being removed because they're very big. So having cards that are one or the other, I think, is very valuable. Having cards that are like small but get lots of value are good, and then they can deal chip damage until your opponent's maybe forced to remove them or trumps them with a better creature. That's good. Having cards that have to be removed but take a little while to set up, I think is also good. You know, those cards that ask questions of your opponent once they're on the field are valuable as well. And Scintilla is nice because it's in the midpoint. It's a good, cheap card that can get value every turn. You can just keep healing. You know, if nothing else, it lets you attack with your general for free. So as long as it's around, it's still valuable as a card, even though it's a cheap drop that also comes down early. Whereas something like a Windblade Adept, it's a pretty good card, but usually later on it's not what you need. It's not good enough. It doesn't have enough impact. Whereas when you're trying to stabilize, Scintilla gaining you life, really, really helpful. And it only costs 4 mana to play her and activate the Blood Surge. So that sort of card is exactly what Lyonar decks need from a perspective of the flow of the game. It lets you stay alive, but it doesn't force your opponent to remove it. If an aggro deck lets it stick, it will eventually let you win. It will build up inevitability like Kaleno does. But it's not quite as powerful as Kaleno because of how Blood Surge works. So on the note of Blood Surge, this is going to come up a few times in this review, so might as well tackle it now. I think Blood Surge is actually very interesting in Duelyst because there are 3 phases of the game, as it were, with regards to your Bloodborne spell. There's the first phase, which is the first 2 turns where you can't use it. The second phase where you can use it every other turn. And then the third phase where you can use it once per turn. And these cards react differently to each of these phases. Some of them are so expensive that you can't really use them until phase 3, but some of them are cheap enough that you can play them at any time. Like this one. So you can play Scintilla on the first turn, but then you can't get any value off of her until turn 3. Obviously she's still a 3/4, so that's fine, but it's worth knowing. You can play her in the mid-game, but you can't gain that much life immediately. You can't force your opponent to remove her and gain life in the same turn, because if you heal one turn, you probably can't heal the next, unless you waited on your Bloodborne spell activation, which has a cost of its own. So there's this really interesting dynamic between the Blood Surge cards having a powerful repeatable effect, but then the game itself limiting how much you can repeat them really early on. And then later on, you know, we've reached the 9 mana stage. Yes, here come the big splashy effects. When your opponent's able to play Pandoras, being able to gain 3 health once a turn is not a big deal, right? So having these cards continue to have their effect later on every single turn, that's absolutely fine. That lets them play with the big boys, as it were, like Pandora and Dark Nemesis and all this massive nonsense, right? Grandmaster Zir, you know, these huge, expensive bombs. Like, being able to activate Scintilla every turn is not really a big deal when your opponent can cast Obliterate. for instance. So allowing this card to scale organically into the late game is a really nice consequence of the slightly awkward Bloodborne spell system. Like, we all had a lot of kind of teething trouble when Bloodborne spells were released, just getting used to when they were. Counterplay had to kind of improve the UI a couple of times because it was really hard to figure out, can I use it this turn or next turn or in 2 turns? Is it on cooldown? You know, and you get confused until the late game where you're like, okay, I can just use it now, that's fine. But now that we've kind of gotten used to it, we're seeing an actual benefit of doing it this way outside of the balance of the powers themselves. It lets Counterplay design these cards that don't immediately snowball. So Hearthstone has the same mechanic called Inspire, and in Hearthstone you can use your hero power once every turn for the whole game. Now they cost 2 mana, so you don't necessarily want to do it early on, but if you have an Inspire minion you can just always activate it, and that means your opponent always has to remove them straight away because most of them are quite powerful. In Duelyst that's not the case. They don't become once per turn activations until quite late in the game when your opponent has access to much more powerful effects. And I really like that because there's a big, kind of as I said earlier, there's a big disparity between, in card games, cards that force you to remove them right now and cards that just kind of don't do that much. You know, finding cards that can sit in the middle and be respectable threats without demanding immediate removal is very valuable. I think Scintilla hits a really nice midpoint. I think this is, again, one of the better designs in the set. I think it's really good. Sunbreaker. Force Field, your Bloodborne spell is Tempest. So, I don't know if this card is, like, good. I've played against it, I think, once. I was on very low life, so it wrecked me. That was the only time I've seen someone actually cast one. But, let me just point out how lovely this design is. This card is nice. It's got a couple of components. It has Force Field and it deals damage to everything. So, the damage pings off the Force Field, which will regenerate during your opponent's turn, meaning you don't lose any value unless you attack with it. And the Sunbreaker takes no damage from its own ability. That's just nice. It's satisfying, right? You play this card and you're like, oh, that felt good. There's some aesthetic quality to good card designs. Card games are very good for this because you don't need a lot of mechanics to make a certain unit work. Like, this card has 6 words of rules text, one of which is a keyword, 2 numbers, and a name and a creature type. You know, that's 8 words and 2 numbers. And 3 numbers, it has a mana cost. Duh. That's not a lot of real estate, you know, that's pretty simple as cards go. That's quite restrained. Most Magic the Gathering cards have a lot more text than that. Same number of numbers, but many more rules. So being able to make a design that's this elegant, but also has 2 rules which fit together so neatly and so cleanly, that's really elegant. That's kind of almost the definition of elegance. It's just a very well put together card. Like, another way you could do it would be having it heal to full every time it dealt damage, sort of like Hank Hart does. But that's more words, and it's clunkier. But you can do the same thing with Force Field. Plus, it also means that Sunbreaker itself is relatively resilient, which is sort of nice from just a power level perspective, in that you can play it and it won't always immediately die, and then you can use your now expensive Bloodborne spell next turn. Whereas playing this as a 6 mana play is pretty unimpactful. So it's nice that you can probably stick it for a turn. But I just like this card because of how neatly those 2 parts dovetail together. That's just nice. It shows a good appreciation for the craft, you know, like when cards like this come out. Trinity Oath. So this is by far the most played of Lyonar's new cards. It goes in basically everything because it's just a very pushed draw spell. So I was a bit confused when this card came out, actually. I like that it restores health. I think that's exactly the sort of thing a Lyonar draw spell should do. I like that it triggers Zerans, healing support cards. I like that it keeps you alive if you're playing a slow deck. I like that it slightly offsets the tempo loss of having to play a 4 mana do nothing in your I play big expensive cards and affect the board Lyonar faction deck. I appreciate all of that, but I'm a bit confused about just how powerful it is. I'm not sure that Lyonar is really the faction that wants a 4-mana draw 3, because they have all these individually powerful cards already. There's always been something awkward about draw in Lyonar. We've had Lionheart's Blessing and Solarius for a while, and obviously we can make good use of Sojourner and things like Spelljammer. Sojourner's really nice in Lyonar because you can buff her with Argian's Bloodborn spell, and then she's a 3/5 and that's actually scary. Yada yada yada. None of this is news to experienced players, but interestingly, none of these cards have ever really felt good enough. Solarius is clunky and expensive, and you sort of, he sits in your hand and then you're like, oh, I could cast it, but I want to affect the board and make tempo plays. Lionheart Blessing is kind of crap and takes setup, and it's cute with the when you heal, deal 2 damage to everything, whose name I've temporarily forgotten. Let me just fix that. Sunriser, there she is. Yeah, really good with Sunriser because you can draw like 3 cards off it. But, you know, generally not an amazing card. Sorry, I've just remembered my face is probably in front of the Sunriser there. I'll pull her up on the screen. There she is. Yeah, you combo Lionheart's Blessing with this. And in theory you get some value, but although I've seen someone do that once, it's really situational. You know, you're putting a situational card on a different situational card and it's all a bit rubbish. Trinity Oath is none of that. It's still a tempo loss to play it, but it's only 4 mana, so it's not that much of a tempo loss. It heals you, so it's not that much of a tempo loss. You can usually play something else after it, even if it's just a slow or a Blood Tier Alchemist. And in the late game, you can Trinity Oath and play an Ironcliffe Guardian. That's great. And it weirds me out that Lion are a faction with no card drawing but great cards, where the lack of card draw let control decks beat them or let the aggro deck, the aggro Lyonar deck, occasionally run out of steam. Gets this draw card that's so strong. Like, so Vitruvian got Divine Spark with 3 mana draw 2, and I'd sort of, if you asked me ahead of time, I'd expect them to be the other way around. I'd expect Lyonar to get 3 mana draw 2 heal 3, or even 4 mana draw 2 heal 4, say. And Vitruvian to get 4 mana draw 3 cards probably don't heal anything. Because Vitruvian seemed like the sort of faction that deserved that kind of effect, and could use it. I think of Vitruvian as a faction with card draw. They used to have, you know, Science Second Wish used to be 2 mana draw 2 cards. It was too powerful, so they changed it to another buff spell, but, you know, Vitruvian in some way are supposed to be able to draw cards. And it feels strange to me that they get the playable but still quite bad draw spell, and Lyonar get the draw 3. You know, 3 is so much bigger than 2 when you're looking at draw spells. So I don't think the card is like broken or should be banned or anything, but I find it odd that that's meant to be for Lyonar. I had never thought of Lyonar as a faction with good card draw. You know, you can get it if you work for it. Like, you can play Solarius, you can play Sun Sister's Therapy and make lots of True Strikes and replace them. You can play, you know, your neutral options. You can play Lionheart Blessing, but just to be able to put no effort in and get a draw 3 seems to go against the faction's core for me. I think that's odd. But I'll be interested to see if this trend continues. Like, are Lyonar going to get another draw spell? Is Trinity Oath going to get nerfed? You know, if it was 5 mana, I think that would feel more Lyonar to me. You know, that it's clunky. Like, Lyonar cards are normally quite clunky. I mean, I think it's pretty reasonable to give a faction with a profusion of clunky cards a really streamlined one that lets them glue the clunky cards together. But given how powerful the clunky cards are, that also strikes me as odd. Like, you know, you're putting draw 3s and Holy Immolations in the same deck. And that's just a lot of raw advantage and power. So I thought that was strange. And so far, you know, it's turned out the card is great. No surprises there. It's seeing playing basically every Lyonar deck, no surprises there. That in itself is not a problem. I mean, Mercantile Warbeast is a card, right? it is okay for cards to see regular play in every deck for a while. But it would be nice if Trinity Oath was at a place where only some decks wanted it, or had a reason to want it. It might be, maybe all decks want it for different reasons, but there should be a reason to want this card rather than it just being bonkers, because that doesn't feel like Lyonar to me. Alright, now from Trinity Oath, Xcelius. So this thing is funny. It's really funny. I have only played against it once. My opponent played this and I think they played it and put an Aegis barrier on it. And I played Sunset Paragon or something and just killed it. I forget exactly what I did. Anyway, it was still a huge minion. It was like an 11/11 or something. That's pretty scary. So I like this thing. I think this is the sort of card Lyonar should have. Like, this. We all know that Lyonar already have effectively a bit of rules text on their cards that's kind of hidden that says you have to kill this now, otherwise it'll get loaded down with Raw, Holy Immolation and Divine Bond and you'll die. That, I think, is a bit tedious. It's nice to have a card that is just straight up, honestly, this is massive, you have to kill it. The point about Lyonar forcing you to remove everything all of the time is kind of a side point, but I'll get back to that in a minute, because I think that's a criticism worth bringing up of the faction in general. But it's not relevant to this particular card, other than as a point of comparison. I love the honesty of Xcelius. Like, it's like it's a 10/10 or a 15/15 with celerity. Obviously, it's going to kill you next turn. It's got Provoke, so it can help stabilize. Like, that's hilarious. There's just something nice about playing these massive, really swingy minions. But it costs so much mana that, you can't combo with it or anything, so that's kind of the ceiling of it. You can put Aegis Barrier on it, which is great, obviously, but that's it. And doesn't save it from its worst enemy, Ephemeral Shroud. So, I think this card is a very fitting finisher for a slow Lyonar deck. It's big, it's clunky, but it will insta-kill them next turn if they let it untap. I think that's very Lyonar. I think that, it suits their playstyle very well. So, going back to the Divine Bond thing, it's not directly related to this expansion, but one problem that games like Duelyst and Hearthstone have, Hearthstone has it worse than Duelyst usually, but it's still a big enough problem in this game that's worth mentioning. There is an impetus in Duelyst to kill all of your opponent's minions all the time. Just never let them have anything on board. Now, in Duelyst, sometimes you can't. One of the nice things about Duelyst's board is that you can hide things behind your general, play minions far away, and otherwise protect stuff. And it's important to have some amount of removal that can ignore that can reach across the board and say, no, that ranged minion has to go away, or no, that Shadow Dancer has to die. No, I need to kill your minion before it gets a mana tile, or I just want to make a temple play and remove your cheap thing. That's fine. I obviously have no problem with that. Generally, as a player, I'm a fan of removal. What I don't like so much about Lyonar in particular, but also a lot of the cards that do see play, like Revenant and any card in an aggro deck basically, is that you so often can't allow yourself to take damage. It's possible to plan ahead and say, no, I can actually take this. But especially with Lyonar, if you just leave a minion up, they have so many ways to make it enormous or get extra value off it, like Holy Immolation, or even just, using Arjun's Bloodborn spell, that minion suddenly becomes terrifying. And you feel like you can't leave any of their minions unanswered. Now, as a faction, that can be okay. Thematically, Lyonar can just be that faction to say, hey, here's my thing, can you deal with it? No? Here's my other thing, can you deal with it? That's a very mid-range playstyle. That's fine. I don't like it when it gets old. Every time you play against Lyonar, you kind of get into that mental groove of, okay, I have to kill everything, every turn, no questions. Like, when you repulse a beast, a Lyonar minion, it feels really bad because it probably gets rid of it, but if they're playing Magnetize, you lose the game kind of thing. It's that bad, Just avoiding them often isn't enough. sometimes it is, as provided you've got space to run to or good body blockers, but because Lyonar gets so much more benefit out of having random minions on board than anyone else, you feel compelled to kill everything. And the flip side, of course, is when you're playing a Lyonar deck and you're slightly behind, and then your opponent is removing your minions, you've got all these like holy immolations stuck in your hand doing nothing, or being very clunky. You can still, now that slow exists, you can still play them. 4 mana slow holy immolations, very strong play, very strong tempo swing. But generally, because you know that all you need to do is stick a minion and you're at a huge advantage, and your opponent knows that they just have to kill everything, it really polarizes the playstyle of the faction. I mentioned when I was talking about Scintilla that I really like how she doesn't kind of go in for that. As a minion herself, she's pretty middle of the road. Her ability gets you value over the course of a long game, but not that much and not immediately. But because of Lyonar's core mechanics, even she still has to be auto-removed if you expect your opponent's playing Afterblaze or Arjune's Hero Power or Holy Immolation or any of that stuff. I don't know what necessarily could be done. Like, nerfing Divine Bond, and by nerfing I mean reworking it, could be an interesting way to do that, because Divine Bond is sort of the biggest culprit in that against most Lyonar minions, if you leave them up and your opponent doesn't have Divine Bond, you take like 4, maybe 6 extra damage, which is not the worst thing. If you're on 20, you can probably survive and then find something, you can set up a play, take a bunch of face damage, and then do something to swing the game next turn. With Divine Bond, you can't do that because they can find lethal from almost any life total once the game's gone on enough, if they have stuff. If they start the turn with a couple of minions in play, Divine Bond in hand, you're probably just dead. And often, you're on 20, you're sort of like, okay, if he has Divine Bond, I die. I can't. And you have to play around it to the extreme of, well, I have to kill his minion. That's the only thing I can do. Sometimes you can body block, but obviously when the Ironclef Guardian is next to you, there's only so much you can do. So, as a note unrelated to Rise of the Bloodborne, I would personally quite like to see Divine Bond reworked. And maybe Holy Immolation? I'm not sure. Just something to mean that leaving Lyonar minions on board doesn't always just lose you the game. But at the same time, the Lyonar player doesn't have to have quite so many cards in the deck or in the hand that rely on having minions on board, but then are so swingy when you do. And they're sort of a bit clunky as a result. Like, cheap cards that gain you benefits, like buff spells that draw a card, things like Afterblaze. It's not that cheap, but Afterblaze is very good for this, because you're rewarded by it cycling a card, not by you winning the game. It still represents a lot of tempo and damage, but that's okay, it costs 3 mana. Divine Bond, it doesn't draw you a card, it doesn't do anything unless you're killing your opponent with it in a lot of cases. If you use it to trade with a minion, it feels awful. Whereas Afterblaze is kind of, it's not that much extra face damage, but it just makes your minion really big. Sometimes you get some card advantage by drawing an extra card and making your minion large and getting a good trade. That's much more what I'd like to see of the faction. These sort of slightly fairer cards that reward you for sticking minions, but don't always instantly ruin your opponent in the process. So I think it'd be nice to see a bit more of that in Lyonar. I like the direction where these 6 cards have gone. I think they mostly fall into that category, where they're not unbeatable when stuck on board, but are very powerful. I mean, except Xcelius, but he's really expensive. And, dies to removal. Yeah. Right, I think that wraps Lyonar up. Next, Songhai.